Hello YouTube, hope you're having a great day today. Today I want to take a look at Gary Gygax's Appendix N and talk about what I think the importance of it is, what the value of it is to a modern reader, and so forth, and why I'm really inspired by it. So, if you'll remember, I've talked about Gary Gygax a few times on this channel. There was a place where I talked about Gary Gygax's sort of Dungeons and Dragons and Essential Conflict as one of the four sort of pillars of modern fantasy, and any modern fantasy work that comes along afterwards, I think, owes one of its four major debts of gratitude to Gary Gygax, and how his Dungeons and Dragons game was sort of this final four inspirations for the fantasy genre, the modern fantasy genre. And if you're interested in checking out that video more, I'll give you a link to it below. In addition to that, I do think he also has done a lot in other things, particularly with Appendix N. In Appendix N, what Gygax does is, this is an appendix that's near the end of the first edition of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, where he writes the very first Dungeon Master's Guide. This is basically a couple of years after Dungeons and Dragons is a hit, and he adds some new things to it in a more complex version of the game that's called AD&D. And in AD&D, in Appendix N, what he basically does is he says, these are all the places where I got the inspiration for this game, or the fantasy world that I created, the monsters, the characters, the creatures, and the concepts. And if you're interested in coming up with ideas for your campaigns, or your worlds, and so forth, these are the sources that I would suggest you go. So it's both a credit list and then also a source of things. Now, one of the reasons people think he might have done that was because the Tolkien estate was making some noise towards potentially suing him for saying that he had basically used Tolkien's works ad nauseum and just took them wholesale. And I do think that there's a couple of things that he did, and Tolkien is listed certainly as one of the people on this list. But the list is giant. It has a ton of different things, and I do think there's a lot more things that came from other places. I think there are definitely some works out there that are more Dungeons and Dragons-ish than the Middle-earth stuff from Tolkien, like The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. Although, again, those are very influential, don't get me wrong. So today what I want to do is take a look kind of at the Appendix N. Now, Appendix N does have, like I said, a long list of things, and I have not read everything on Appendix N, nor probably will I ever. Some of them are entire series by people and so forth, and they're entire authors that I don't even have a single thing by. But that's the cool thing about Appendix N and Gary Gygax. You can go wherever you want to go, and I think that's pretty cool. And Gary Gygax lists a big number of things. Some of those things go back pretty far, some of those things are much closer by. He also at the end will say which ones were more influential, where he got the most influence, like Jack Vance, Fritz Leiber, Robert Howard, stuff like that he'll list. And so forth. But again, I think it's very interesting because this is where so many of the sort of the modern ideas came from. He collected many of these different sources and resources together to create what I consider to be some of the greatest sort of concepts for modern and tropes for modern fantasy, from video games, board games, collectible card games, movies, TV shows, novels, whatever. Any sort of media that we're talking about today that's modern fantasy has, in a post-Gygaxian world, is very Gygaxian. Just like it's very Tolkienian, it's very Moorcockian, and it's very Howardian, if that's actually a word. But they're very much like those four other major influences too. But Gygax is the one who put it all together and brought in a bunch of other influences too. Fantasy today is very much in the Gygax sort of genre and formula, following the tropes that he kind of brought together, codified, and established. And while he wasn't the creator of all these tropes, he definitely brought them together, much in the same way that Sherlock Holmes is not the original detective. There were many detectives written before him, but Arthur C. Clarke definitely sort of codifies the detective trope. And after the detective trope is sort of codified and made detectives, then any story that's written thereafter is going to have a sort of Sherlock Holmes sort of feel to it, because it's the one that sort of brought everything together. Again, even though it wasn't the first detective story. It wasn't the detective story, first detective story by years and years and years. Edgar Allan Poe was probably the inventor of that story and that genre. Still, nevertheless, and it's the same thing with Gygax. Gygax's works and his worlds and his creations are kind of like our sort of Sherlock Holmes for modern fantasy. It created a lot of these tropes. It wasn't the first, but in many places it was the codifier, and brought a lot of these things from different books and such. So let's take a look at some of the ones that he talks about very quickly, how much influence I think they came from, what I think came from them, and again with the caveat that I haven't read everything and I won't be talking about everything. Let's go ahead and get started. He has a big number of things. One of the first things he does is he goes back to some of his older stuff. He has some stuff in there by Edgar Rice Burroughs. In particular, I think Edgar Rice Burroughs was one of the greatest writers of the pulp era, so there's a large number of Burroughs works that I think are definitely in the queue. The ones that go into the Hollow World, Cespar, as well as I think the John Carter of Mars series also has a lot from it too. And there's lots of other things in a sort of Burroughs works that I think are definitely there too. I don't think Burroughs is as much of an influence because he was one of the first writers. I think a lot of writers that came later had some different things that they brought to the table in a very different way. For example, I think that A. Merritt, who is also on his list as one of the great influences. Abraham Merritt is his first name, but he publishes under A. Merritt. Abraham Merritt, who I'm going to use because that's my name, he writes a lot of sort of Lost World stuff, and his stuff is going to read Dwellers in the Mirage, the Moon Pool, stuff like that is going to read much more like an adventure. Many of his things are going to kind of read like some of the earliest adventure stories that you're going to find out there in fiction. So they're going to have that very much kind of sort of a take. He has a great classic in fantasy, which we haven't reviewed yet for this channel, called The Ship of Ishtar, which is supposed to be really influential, but I don't see The Ship of Ishtar as much as I see like Dwellers in the Forgotten Mirage or stuff like that. I see those much more as these sort of adventures, dungeon crawls and such forth, in these sort of forgotten kingdoms and forgotten ruins and such, much more in Dungeons and Dragons, particularly early D&D, and Gygax's creation than I do The Ship of Ishtar. But we'll take a look at that in a later review. There are other ones out there too. Lord Dunsany's another one too that he talks about at length. Lord Dunsany we've looked at before. He wrote The Gods of Pegana, which is very Dungeons and Dragons-ish, in that the writer actually creates his own mythos for his own created fantasy world that he calls Pegana, and that was the first time anybody had ever done that. So clearly that was heavily influential, because I think a lot of Dungeons and Dragons that came to follow definitely sort of follows The Gods of Pegana and some of these other works that kind of describe these gods, describe these mythoses, and they do so from myths, legends, and so forth, rather than one large cohesive epic story that just happens to tell the mythology of the world as a part of that story, which is very, very much like the sort of source books that you're going to be reading in any sort of game that came afterwards from the role-playing genre. So again, Gygax definitely gets, I think, not only some of the ideas from him and some of these books and so forth, but also that from as well. There are also some elves in some of his later works like that I think are starting to represent what elves look like in his world too, and such. But I think a lot of his stuff is more kind of like fairy tales and such, so it doesn't feel as Dungeons and Dragons-ish as I think some other sources do. H.P. Lovecraft has a lot of stuff too. He's also on Appendix N. H.P. Lovecraft, I think more his dream stuff, that's this book actually pulled out here, the dream cycle of stuff that's set in like the Quest of Unknown Kadath and stuff like that, where he is in a sort of dream world. He's writing these in a pseudo-Dunsany style, so he's trying to bring that in. This was at a time when Lovecraft was very, very popular and famous, and becoming so in fantasy, horror, and other sort of folks that were out there reading a lot. So this is definitely something that would have been more read by people in Gygax's day. He would have definitely been, familiar with a lot of those sorts of things. And I do think, again, you're going to see some of this sort of questing. You're going to see, the night gaunts, this sort of dream sort of a concept and so forth that are going to be coming out from Lovecraft. Although I think it's more of a sort of a big picture sort of an influence, much like Dunsany, than any specific. Here are some specific things that come from this writer that I think I can sort of lay out for you. He also talks about Robert E. Howard's Conan stuff. Again, hugely influential. I think we would all agree. Some things came specifically from this world, like the Barbarian class. I also think that the original world feels more, the original D&D world feels very sword and sandal. It's not heavy, high, and magic, and I think one of the reasons for that is Robert E. Howard's works. Howard is probably one of the best at writing this sort of a low-tech, low-magic world where you're kind of, your sword arm and your swords are going to be your major source of punching people. It's not a world of Gandalfs and so forth like Tolkien. And I definitely think the sort of a low fantasy that Robert E. Howard has is also something you're going to see, as well as, again, barbarians, stuff like that are going to be coming out of here ad nauseum. And speaking about barbarians, you're also going to see barbarians coming in from this, from Vance Leiber's Lankhmar. I would consider this and this series specifically to probably be one of the 3 or 4 most influential in Dungeons & Dragons period. And in this one, he creates, the author, Leiber has a series of 4 separate books of short stories that were written almost over 50 years of time, set with these 2 thieves in a thieves guild in a city called Lankhmar. Well, the thieves guild, the thieves camp, the abilities these two thieves have is very much like thieves today. Everything from the thief class, thieves, rogues, and so forth comes from this. So anything that you have from any source, really, that has thieves or thieves classes that you're playing, rogue classes, they're all coming from this, and this series. It also features one of the 2 thieves as a barbarian, so you can kind of see a barbarian as a thief rather than as a stupid warrior. Here he's actually a smart and savvy thief, even though he's like 7 feet tall, and so forth. So you can also kind of see some barbarian stuff from that. Also, I think any sort of fantasy work that has a large city definitely draws its inspiration from this too, because this is kind of the first sort of large city of Lankhmar, probably one of the most iconic cities in fantasy. So Gygax certainly would have gotten his idea for what a fantasy city looks like from Lankhmar and so forth. In fact, Lankhmar was even made an actual campaign world in Dungeons & Dragons in TSR, so you can go play in Lankhmar or add Lankhmar and these characters to your world. So that definitely was a big influence, as you can see. I think a lesser influence was the Roger Zelazny works, also mentioned in Appendix N. Roger Zelazny's main works that are mentioned are going to be the Chronicles of Amber. I think is his main one. The Chronicles of Amber does have this sort of law versus chaos as its central theme. That's also a theme in a couple of other books we're going to be looking at here in a minute. So I think it kind of continue to have that sort of theme resonate. It has a unique magic system which has nothing to do with Dungeons & Dragons at all, and some other sort of basic concepts of planes and planar existences and such, which I also don't think is here too. So I think the influences of Zelazny on Dungeons & Dragons are much less than some other writers are. And again, it's probably going to be more sort of your basic sort of fighting and so forth, of your central sort of conflict being law versus chaos, which is this is definitely about, and so forth. Now, speaking of the other writer I want to talk about a little bit more. This is Michael Moorcock. Michael Moorcock is definitely the person who sort of codified law versus chaos. He also has a central eternal champion who has separate sort of creations on all these different planes. He creates the idea of this sort of planar interactions in the multiverse. That's actually a word he creates as well as a concept he creates. So he's hugely influential. He's got gods of chaos and law that you're serving and fighting for or against and trying to stomp them on these various planes. It's this giant planar conflict and so forth, and all that stuff is created for the first time. And I would say that probably Moorcock is probably one of the 3 or 4 biggest influences on Dungeons & Dragons by far, because so many different ideas come from him, including the characters of Elric as this first major anti-hero in fantasy, which is something that's going to resonate. The sort of Stormbringer, which is going to resonate. It's even in Dungeons & Dragons First Edition as Black Razor. So there's a lot of these sort of concepts that are definitely brought in from Moorcock. So I think Moorcock is going to be one of the biggest influences for Dungeons & Dragons and Appendix N. I also think that while you're taking a look at the sort of concept of law versus chaos, Paul Anderson's 3 Hearts and 3 Lines, I would say this is also one of the 5 biggest influences in Dungeons & Dragons, maybe even top 3, this single book. And that's because this book has pretty much everything in it is going to be in the law versus chaos or its concepts. The main character is a paladin. That's where the paladin class is going to come from. Everything from trolls regenerating to nixies to swan maze to magic spells that are in here. They're going to be brought over. The central conflict is law versus chaos, and many more things. It's got elves, it's got so many different things in it. This is, I think, very much Dungeons & Dragons before Dungeons & Dragons. And this is also interesting because it's a pre-Tolkienian Dungeons & Dragons too. So it's interesting to kind of read a key fantasy work that was printed prior to Tolkien's Lord of the Rings becoming so popular and well-read. Speaking of Tolkien, let's go ahead and look at him. Tolkien adds a definite, strong good versus evil. And again, he wasn't the first person to do it, but I definitely think he codified it and made this sort of epic, world-spanning good versus evil on a big, giant scale. And a lot of things definitely are going to follow that as a result. And a lot of his things are going to come over too. His concepts of elves, and I think dwarves and hobbits are definitely ones that are going to definitely resonate. You're also going to see the ranger class is going to be one that's a big, heavy thing too. And again, his sort of central concept of good versus evil. And also Tolkien has followed Dunsany's lead in having this very fleshed out world with a mythos, language, and such like that. So that's sort of a big picture, fleshed out my world, fleshed out this thing very, very detailed, is also something you're going to see in Dungeons & Dragons and heavily influenced from Gygax as well. So also you're going to get kind of this tone as well. So another thing that he also talks about too, and I think this is probably another one of the top 5 biggest influences on Dungeons & Dragons, is Jack Vance's Dying Earth. If you've heard of Vancian magic, magic systems and so forth, but you've never actually read this small little tiny collection of 6 short stories, do yourself a favor and spend some time doing it. I could not recommend it more. And we've actually looked at one of the short stories in this already, just recently. This is an incredibly strong and evocative work. It's very different from anything that was out there before, since it's also pre-Tolkienian. It's set in sort of the last days of the dying world, where everybody knows the world is going to be dying at any moment now, so morality and such and helping other people has gone out the window, and everybody's kind of in it for themselves in a sort of hedonistic end of the era sort of a hurrah kind of a thing. It definitely introduces this idea of magicians with named spells. They're going to have spells in there named after themselves, like Fandal's Mantle of Stealth, which is just an invisibility spell, or spells that are named like the Excellent Prismatic Spray, stuff like that, from the fact that they can only memorize a certain number of spells a day. They have limited powers. They're trying to create things. Everything from iron stones to different creatures and world building and so forth. This also comes from here too. I definitely think that you want to check this out. It has a level of quirkiness, darkness, and weirdness to it that is definitely true for Dungeons & Dragons. And spells like Tasha's Uncontrollable Hideous Laughter as a 2nd level spell. This is where stuff like that came from, as well as the whole magic system. Wizards and stuff came from this fully. Now, Wizards actually had a little bit of a lesser influence, I think, from The Face and the Frost, which we also just looked at too. I just read this like 3 weeks ago. This is a little young adult novel from '69. It's also in Gygax's Appendix N. I went and checked it out. In this, it's kind of a wizard buddy trip between two wizards, Prospero and Roger Bacon. It can be read very quickly. I read it in 1 day. It's not something that I think is really that great. I don't think it influenced Dungeons & Dragons in major ways, but I do think this idea of this sort of grounded wizard who isn't somebody like a Gandalf or a Merlin or somebody like that who's super powerful, can cause all these great things to happen. But instead are just regular people like you and me trying to make a living and get through the day. And that's something that definitely feels more like a Dungeons & Dragons wizard than like some of the other previous sort of high fantasy wizards too. So I think that sort of a feel is one that definitely came through. But other than that, I don't think there's as much there. And then there's a couple of other pieces that I still have copies of. One is Fred Saberhagen's Empire of the East, or some other stuff by Fred Saberhagen came out. He was kind of big more in the science fiction side with some of his Berserker stuff. And he also has some influential stuff on the fantasy side too. You're going to get a chance to see some of it in his Tolkien's works. I do think he's less influential on a smaller scale, more on a bigger scale. He has a lot of his worlds have a sort of an older tech sort of a feel to them, almost like tech that has been forgotten. Very much similar to kind of Anne McCaffrey's Dragon Riders of Pern initial trilogy, where in the first couple of books you're trying to figure out all the old technology of this spacefaring race that was lost to fight the thread that's falling from the sky, like flamethrowers and stuff. In a similar way, you've got like tanks and stuff in Empire of the East being sort of refound and reused in that modern sense. And that's something that happened in other places too. Michael Moorcock was doing that in his first Eternal Champion story in the 50s and such. This is an ongoing kind of high tech in our world with all these sort of lost weapons. What are we going to do with them? Kind of a concept. But it's definitely one that I think that sort of resonated. Although I think that's going to be better seen in Hero's Journey, which is the final of the books we're going to be looking at today. Hero's Journey, I think, has actually probably one of the most forgotten classics. I think more things came from Hero's Journey than people realize until you've read it and appreciate it. I think that, for example, the Druid class comes from this. The name of the Druid class doesn't come from this, but every other thing that comes from the Druid class is here. A separate set of magic. People that aren't more neutral than involved with politics, and they're only going to come out of their shelves when the world's on fire and needs to be saved. They're more pro-plant and pro-land than anything else, and so on. They're respected by animals. They have a separate set of spells and so forth. Here, it's in a post-apocalyptic universe, so the magic spells are actually psionics. The psionic system in here that your main character has is actually identical down to the T to the psionic system that's in first edition Dungeons & Dragons. So you're also getting your psionic system from this too, as well as basically this concept of a world after a post-apocalyptic event has happened, and now things have been mutated, and you're riding a giant moose, your best friend is an intelligent psychic bear, and so forth. So it's a lot of fun. And if you can't, I mean, it's going to be something, it's from the 70s, it's fun. You're not going to regret that you either picked it up or spent the time in reading it. And again, I think there's a lot more things in this, but most important thing that this has that I think you need to understand, this is where a crucial concept has come from, and nobody has ever did it before, or I think has actually just done it justice in fiction sense. The concept of leveling up. Our main character, after he has encounters with certain characters, his powers will become more stronger, and he'll be able to do more things with his psionics. So he's actually going to level up during the course of this story, which I think is incredibly interesting because this came before the idea of leveling up as a game mechanic. So this is not just where druids, psionic systems, swords, concepts, magical users, and stuff like that came from, but also where leveling up came from too, which I think is very important. So again, I think that book is, I think, a forgotten classic, and I've actually reviewed it. It was one of the first things I reviewed for you because I love it so much. So that takes a look at some of the things that I've read from Appendix N, and the writers from Appendix N that I've personally read. Now again, there's many of them out there that I have either read just maybe one or two stories from, like Manly Wade Wellman. I think I've read like 2 of his stories, or somebody who I just have never really sat down and sort of read from beginning to end, like Sprag de Camp or something like that. So there are definitely some writers on Appendix N that I still just have not turned to, and that's okay. Again, it's kind of take it where you are, approach it with who you are, and so on and so forth. But what I wanted to do with you is kind of talk about what the importance of was, I thought, from Appendix N, and what sort of, I think, these sort of sources have given Dungeons and Dragons and through Dungeons and Dragons and Gygax to us today. Because again, you cannot escape the yes, the Druid class, for example, came from Hero's Journey, but that's not just a D&D thing. The modern sort of Druid context of a character, of a philosophy, and so forth in fantasy is one that's resonated beyond just the mere one in Dungeons and Dragons, right? So you can be reading a book that has a Druid in it with that sort of a modern sort of a Druid take that comes from Sterling Lanier's world, but in reality it's actually something that he probably picked up from Gygax or somebody else, not realizing that's actually a Sterling Lanier creation. So you can see these things today in other works, not just in Dungeons and Dragons. And that's why I think Appendix N is very important, because this is the place where you can sort of do your own reading and do your own exploring to see where all these different and fun things are coming from, and kind of developing the world in this and modern fantasy and so forth. So anyway, that's what I wanted to share with you today. Hey, I appreciate it if you took some time out of your day and invested it. If you spent this time with me, we all have busy days and we all have busy lives. And so if you spent it with me, hey, I really do appreciate it. So thank you so much. If you liked this video, then there's no reason not to hit that big giant red subscribe button down there in the corner. There's going to be so many more reviews and follow. I mainly do reviews with the occasional sort of analysis piece like this one. But I'm mainly more interested in reviewing some of the lost great classics of fantasy, science fiction, and horror for you folks. So feel free to hit that subscribe button, and we'll go ahead and see you later. Have a good one.